you were part of the world's first pediatric gender clinic.
We became maybe the first really formal gender clinic, starting circa 1975. Richard Green, he was one of the strong advocates to removing homosexuality from the DSM. So here he is on the one hand, get homosexuality out. On the other hand, let's get GID and transsexualism in. Now, why would that be? Well,
completely incoherent, yeah.
No, it's completely understandable, actually, which is this, Stella. If you wanted to have any cred, you need to be inside the tent. A very high percentage of kids who socially transition long before puberty stay socially transitioned by mid-adolescence. I received around $550,000, plus they paid all of my legal fees, so it came to like $800,000. And they apologized for certain things that they said about me. The activists have very successfully put the gender identity tail on the sexual orientation dog.
Welcome, Dr. Kenneth Zucker, to our podcast. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Same here. I won't say thank you for having me because I might regret it.
See what you say in an hour.
Now, we're both in Ontario, you and I. I'm in Ottawa, you're in Toronto. And you started, you were part of the world's first pediatric gender clinic. Am I correct? That was in Toronto?
I would say that we became maybe the first really formal gender clinic, starting circa 1975. Before that, Richard Green and Stoller at UCLA kind of had a clinic, but it was more, I think, informal. But yeah.
So they had one for children too?
They saw children. And also there was another group at UCLA consisting of psychologists like Lovas, who had a little group. Whether they were formal clinics, not as clear.
When I was looking into the origins of the diagnoses, I came across, there was a little, I think it was an anecdote in a book that I was reading, How Sex Changed by Joanna Meyerowitz, I think. And she was saying that gender non-conforming children became a research interest in the 1960s because all the men showing up at the gender clinics, Green, Money, Stoller's clinics, were saying that they had always been feminine from early childhood. And they turned their attention to feminine boys, but the idea at the time was to intervene and prevent adult transsexuality. Is that correct?
Pretty much. So you're absolutely right. By the 60s, the term transsexual was being used. Harry Benjamin's 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, the emergence of gender clinics for adults across North America and Europe. And so at UCLA, first Richard Green was, as a medical student, working with John Money at Johns Hopkins. They published 2 papers in 1960 and 1961 about what they called gender incongruence, interestingly enough, in boys.
Oh.
And as time went on, I want to connect what you just said to the DSM-3 in 1980, because I think historically this is very important. So by the time I was, in Toronto in the mid 70s, people were beginning to talk about a DSM-3, so a revision from the 1968 DSM-2. And at that time, psychiatry was going through an incredible paradigm shift, like where the people running the show were
Yeah.
no longer the analysts, and academic psychiatry was being taken over by people who were very skeptical of psychoanalysis, who wanted to be able to document things quantitatively, empirically, reliably, validly. So the DSM-3 in 1980 was a monumental sea change where the basic idea was, let's come up with a list of coherent symptoms for a particular diagnosis that hang together and can be evaluated reliably. And it was in DSM-3 that the diagnosis of gender identity disorder of childhood and transsexualism, which was for adolescents and adults, made its way into the DSM-3. Now, one could ask, why did it make its way into the DSM-3? Richard Green, who played a pretty big role in it getting into the DSM-3, once wrote that it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory, meaning, he was no great fan of psychiatric diagnoses when it came to sexology. For example, he was one of the strong advocates to removing homosexuality from the DSM. So here he is on the one hand, get
Wow. Yeah.
homosexuality out. On the other hand, let's get GID and transsexualism in. Now, why would that be? Well,
Completely incoherent. Yeah.
no, it's completely understandable, actually, which is this, Stella. If you wanted to have any cred, you need to be inside the tent, not outside the tent. So you needed to have a diagnosis to justify the work you were doing. Otherwise, why would a psychiatric hospital want you? Now I'm saying that probably like 75% serious, that having a diagnosis gives credibility to the work people are doing.
The timeline the timeline is really interesting, and I've actually always wanted to do a visual timeline because it's so complicated. But Green, they start studying the effeminate boys, the sissy boy syndrome study, the famous one. Prospective, it's 20 years. They start in the 1960s, so they don't have the results until the mid 1980s. But in the meantime, gender identity disorder of childhood, Green succeeds in getting that as a diagnosis in the DSM. But what you just said about homosexuality is really interesting, because homosexuality was removed in 1973 from the DSM. Gender identity disorder of childhood was put in 1980. Did they?
One
Did
caveat
any?
to that. In
Okay.
DSM-3, 1980, there still was the diagnosis of ego-dystonic homosexuality.
Yeah,
That
I like that one.
that got removed in DSM-3R in 1987. And then distress about sexual orientation remained as a NOS, or not otherwise specified, diagnosis until DSM-5.
Well, I think we should come back to that because I like that diagnosis and I think it was valuable. But do you see that gender identity disorder of childhood, did they accidentally repathologize homosexuality? Because most of the kids receiving that diagnosis were future homosexuals. They were just diagnosing future homosexuality.
Well, at the time Green started his study, he connected with Robert Stoller at UCLA, who was writing a lot about transsexualism in the 1960s. So he wrote a book, Sex and Gender, 1968, then The Transsexual Experiment, 1975. And he also wrote some case vignettes about what he called childhood transsexualism. So at the time, let's say we're talking late 60s, early 70s, you're collecting a sample of behaviorally feminine boys. Are they on a developmental pathway towards adult transsexualism, or are they going to be on a pathway where they are okay with their gender and identify as gay? So at the very beginning, people weren't sure, but I could say that by the late 70s into the early 80s, many years before Richard published his follow-up in 1987, we already knew that the vast majority of his kids, actually all except one, were not experiencing gender dysphoria in adolescence or young adulthood, and the majority were identifying as gay. So certainly by the mid-'80s, we knew, and other people had also published data like this, that the most common outcome was, in the case of males, androphilia.
So why make it a diagnosis then?
Well, I would say that one of the criticisms of the diagnosis that some people made was, okay, so you've removed homosexuality from the DSM. Have you put the diagnosis of GID into the DSM as a backdoor maneuver? That was one of the criticisms. And I actually wrote a paper with Robert Spitzer, the architect of the DSM, arguing against that argument. And
I've read it.
I can't remember exactly what I said, but I remember saying it would be weird that people like Green, Richard Friedman, and others who were such strong advocates of removing homosexuality proper, that they would behind the scenes saying, yeah, but let's put this diagnosis in. So I don't buy that argument.
That's why I say accidentally. To me, they just accidentally repathologized homosexuality by getting thrown off track onto this whole gender identity trans thing. They didn't realize I don't believe they realized they were doing it. Do you think they just, it was an accidental thing? But do you think they actually did repathologize homosexuality with that diagnosis?
I think that the perspective I have had and still have is that I make a distinction between gender identity and sexual orientation. And what I find interesting in contemporary times, which I've learned over the past 2 or 3 years, thanks to critics like you guys, is that there are some folks
You're very
who
well.
currently don't believe in the concept of gender identity, which I find really interesting because I do believe in it. And
you do? Okay,
that's how.
Explain
Yeah.
it. Explain it to me, because I do not believe in it. What is a gender identity to you?
Well, to me, this is something I've argued, I think, for a very long time. Once I realized I had to argue about something, I think gender identity is in contemporary times, let's just pretend we're only talking about people in the West, but we can talk about other cultures. I think it's part of one's subjective sense of self. And in that sense, it's deeply phenomenological. And I think that in our culture, most people develop some type of gendered sense of self starting at a very young age. And I think that to have, let's say, a variant gender identity, there has to be some standard that you are comparing yourself to. And, one of the contemporary arguments that gender critical people make, which I love intellectually, is they'll say, you can do whatever you want. Who says this is for boys or this is for girls? But kids grow up in a culture and they observe that we are a very gendered culture. And I think gender is a very salient part of all cultures I know of. And it makes me think of a very interesting study a few years ago. I can't remember who wrote it, but they were asking children to talk about the most important things about themselves. And to their surprise, very few kids said anything about gender. Well, I'm good at sports, or, I like gymnastics. But they didn't say anything about I'm a girl or I'm a boy. And they had a footnote saying they were surprised at that, and they thought, well, maybe they didn't mention it because gender goes without saying. Everybody just assumes that it's a salient part of who they are, so they don't even have to bring it up. So my argument is subjectivity. And I would say that, the argument that people make is you can do whatever you want. Doesn't have to be tagged a boy thing or a girl thing. And sure, if one could do that, it would be wonderful. We could all retire, but it's, I'd say, way easier said than done. But certainly
Can I just say, I have a friend.
Yeah.
I have a friend, and she was told you can do whatever you want, and she bought it as such, and she studied to be a tree surgeon, which takes time, and she was the only woman in the course, and she just thought she was just breaking down the binary, you know what I mean? And her teacher, nobody ever said to her, you will need significant levels of upper body strength to be a good tree surgeon. And she became a tree surgeon. She was always mediocre. And she stopped being a tree surgeon because she was never going to be a very good one. You know what I mean? Yeah, she could be one technically, but she didn't have the strength. But anyway, I'm just saying, like, that can really lead somebody down the wrong road,
What I would say briefly is, of course, like in terms of my own therapeutic approach, one is trying to see how flexible kids can be in terms of their gender representations, and to what extent can one increase their comfort. Will that reduce gender dysphoria? And I'll just give two quick examples. Many years ago, we were seeing a 5-year-old girl who would certainly meet the criteria for gender dysphoria at the time. And at school, the kids in kindergarten were having a big debate about whether this kid was a boy or a girl. Now, this kid had a girl's name, but the kid liked to wear blue running shoes. So that meant, oh, so-and-so has to be a boy. And so they're arguing about this and that. And finally, the teacher intervened and said something like, so-and-so likes to do this and likes to do that. So-and-so is a tomboy. And for that kid, that particular kid, that was like a light bulb. Oh, you mean you can be a girl and like to do boy things. And after that, the gender dysphoria dissipated. Now, some critics would say, well, this kid never really had gender dysphoria, but, one can always be a Monday morning quarterback. But, a lot of kids have, I can think of an 8-year-old boy we saw many years ago. He wanted to be a girl. Why? I like to read. Boys don't like to read. Girls like to read, so I want to be a girl. Or I don't like sweating, and girls don't sweat. And so, we did a lot of work about bell distributions. There are some girls who do sweat and some boys who don't. And so certainly exploring their internal gender representations is an approach that I try. And maybe it's effective, or maybe kids just spontaneously realize these things on their own. But, at some point we should talk about the whole new cohort of prepubertal children where the main psychosocial treatment has been a gender social transition long before puberty. And what we know from Christina Olson's longitudinal work, not to be confused with Joanna Olson Kennedy, Christina Olson is finding that a very high percentage of kids who socially transition long before puberty stay socially transitioned by mid-adolescence. And so, at least by, let's say, DSM terminology, their gender dysphoria has persisted, which is very different from what most of us found in the early follow-up studies.
Yes. Oh, God, I have about 10 questions related to that. Going back to the gender identity, though, first of all, I think I agree with you. I'm one of those, I think gender identity doesn't exist, but I think I have a different definition of gender identity. I'm looking at it more like it's protected as a characteristic in Canadian law that, if you have a female gender identity, then you get to go to the female prison.
That's a different point.
That's a political
That's a
point. And exactly. Yeah. The gender identity, I think we all have I don't really know how to disentangle it from just your likes and your personality and I like these things and they're more typically feminine, and I like that's more typically masculine. I don't see it as like a very core component that's fixed and unchanging, which is how I think trans activists, because there's an entire medical model that is built upon aligning your gender identity with your body, that to me makes it a much more concrete, fixed concept. Would you agree?
GenSpec's Bigger Picture Conference Series returns for its 4th landmark international event this September, the 27th and 28th, Saturday and Sunday, in Albuquerque in New Mexico. At this time, we're not just analysing problems, we're shaping the solution. We're looking for a way forward, and we've chosen the best speakers, the best leading thinkers of our generation to discuss how we can move the dial. With the theme Live Not by Lies, Conversation for a Culture in Crisis, this year's conference tackles one of the most urgent challenges of our time: how to speak truth in the face of conformity, confusion, and institutional pressure. As the politicisation of sex and gender continues to divide societies and derail thoughtful discourse and destroy loving and engaged families, this groundbreaking counterpoint to WPATH brings together the world's leading thinkers, clinicians, policymakers, lawyers, politicians, and psychologists to forge a path that is ethical, evidence-based, and grounded in reality. Abigail Schreier will expose the hidden consequences of bad therapy. Dr. Lisa Littmer will present her latest groundbreaking research. Lionel Shriver lays bare how society's fixation on trans identity distorts truth and undermines fundamental freedoms. Peter Boghossian will present Truth Over Lies, bold conversations in a fractured culture. Dr. Patrick Lappert will discuss the impact of trans surgery, while Dr. Quinton van Meter will discuss the impact of hormones. Following defining events in Killarney, Ireland, in Denver, Colorado, in Lisbon, Portugal, we're now coming to Albuquerque in New Mexico. This is more than just a conference, it's a call to action. Join us for 2 days of unflinching honesty, rigorous evidence and solution-focused collaboration. It's time to move the dial and you need to be in the room. Visit genspec.org to secure your place.
Yeah, well, one of the perspectives of the gender affirming clinicians, as they're called nowadays, is a very strong underlying belief in biological essentialism. And I'm more of like a fence sitter in the sense that I adhere to a multifactorial model, and I've done research on both biological and psychosocial aspects of gender dysphoria. But, the essentialist perspective, the born that way perspective, if you adhere to that philosophy, then it becomes much easier to support going down a particular pathway because there's nothing to explore. And in that sense, I don't agree with that approach or that philosophy. I think it's too simplistic. But it has very substantial, clinical implications.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we go back to the tomboy who just she learned that she could be a tomboy and her gender dysphoria disappeared? Because that's the way I've always seen gender dysphoria of childhood or whatever you want to call it, that diagnosis is the distress that these kids feel is just the distress of being different. It's not really, there's nothing more to it. The tomboyish, kids, it's difficult to be different. Kids pick up on the fact that, all the girls like this and I don't like that, and none of the girls like me because of this, and the boys don't want to play with me because I'm a girl. It's difficult not to slot in, and it's difficult to be different. So is that all gender dysphoria of childhood is? It's just a reaction to being different?
Well, one of the things that we know from developmental gender research is that, or let's put it this way, there have been attempts to distinguish between gender identity and gender role expression. And so some studies will say that kids first need to be able to label themselves as being in one box or another box. And once they have mastered that label, they then say, okay, I want to be like other kids who are in the box I'm in. So in that sense, gender identity precedes gender role expression. Other people have argued, well, there are some studies that suggest that kids are already showing gender stereotype behaviors before they even have the capacity to label themselves. And so maybe for those kids, it's like, oh, I like to do A, B, and C. That must mean I'm a boy, or that must mean I'm a girl. So disentangling which comes first can be a little tricky. Now,
can I say something there? I as a kid, I had my own experiences, and I was very much, I want to be in that group. I don't want to be in this group. I hate this group. I hate them. I hate everything they do. and I want to be in that group. And I was very accepted in that group. I was accepted among the boys completely, and I was allowed to do whatever the hell I wanted. There was no imposition. I certainly wasn't forced to wear any sort of dress or pretty things, and I was accepted. So my dysphoria didn't come from not being accepted or not being allowed. I was not made to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, what's really
I mean? I
interesting
was
about
free.
that is that,
Yeah.
historically, when we looked at our sex ratio data of our child referrals, so kids anywhere between 2 and 12, in Toronto, the sex ratio always favored boys, at around, I think, 6-1 of boys to girls. Of our 3-year-olds that we saw back in the day, the sex ratio was 33-1. And
yeah, but Ken, that was because men wouldn't like, boys were never allowed to be girly. Girls being cute and tomboyish is cool.
absolutely,
You wouldn't be dragging them off to a clinic.
So there's 2 or 3 things that are interesting about this. One is, of course, so we could show that on average, girls were referred later in childhood than boys, probably because, at least in Western samples, gender nonconformity is more stigmatized in boys than it is in girls. So for a girl to get referred, I used to argue they have to do more to get referred. So, for example, I saw this is many years ago, a 4-year-old girl who got referred by the kindergarten teacher because she couldn't tell if this kid was a boy or a girl based on her hairstyle and clothing style and her first name. And so she raised concerns with the parents. But what really led the parents to seek out the advice of their family doctor is that this kid was extremely jealous of her younger brother, and she started to run around the house trying to cut his penis off with a scissors so she could have a penis. That led to the referral.
This was not me.
That was, her plan was to cut the penis off and Scotch tape it to her body.
Wow. Future
I
gender surgeon.
saw this kid for follow-up in our follow-up study of girls, and she was cisgender and heterosexual and had no memory of any of this.
Can I ask, Stella, did you ever want a penis? Like, did you ever anatomically want to be a boy?
Yeah, that wasn't a big focus anatomically. The boy's face and all that sort of stuff. I thought boys were beautiful.
Yeah.
I did. The boys were gorgeous. I thought I wanted, but it wasn't focused on the penis. But actually, what I really want to move on to is the DSM.
Yeah,
I
me
just
too.
think
Me too.
so much worse. Could we move it on? Yeah.
Okay, so because DSM-3, you were not too. That was Stoller, Money, Green. They did the diagnoses in DSM-3, but you came along in DSM-3 revision in 1987. Am I correct?
I did, and in my notes, so DSM-3, the goal is to get in the tent. DSM-3R, I was asked to be on the subcommittee dealing with gender identity disorder, and the requirements to make changes in the DSM-3R were pretty relaxed. So I went to a one-day meeting in New York City that was chaired by Spitzer and his wife, Catherine Williams. No, that might not be her name. I better look it up. But all of the people on the DSM-3R committee, Heino Meyer-Ballberg, John Money, Anka Earhart, me. I had proposed some changes to the criteria for girls that were in DSM-3R, that were in DSM-3. And back then I was still using a typewriter, and I sent Spitzer a one-page letter. I still have the onion skin paper somewhere saying, I think we should make these changes, make the criteria not as rigid as they are in DSM-3. Okay, fine. And that was it. And that was my entry. Then DSM-4 started to become stricter. So we had a subcommittee on gender identity disorders that was chaired by Sue Bradley. And it became part of the disorders first evident in infancy, childhood, or adolescence. So our subcommittee was part of the big child psychiatry committee. And the big change that we made was the name. So we collapsed gender identity disorder of childhood and transsexualism into one overarching diagnosis with different criteria sets for children versus adolescents and adults. We had to provide some data to justify this or that, but it was essentially just making decent arguments. And our main changes made their way into the DSM-4, 1994.
And do you think you improved the diagnosis? Did you make it, did you tighten it up, make it more scientific? Was there any science?
Since I played a big role, I think, in making the criteria more precise for children, I hope so. They were still kind of sketchy for adolescents and adults. We didn't make them more polythetic until DSM-5, actually. Now, in DSM-4, a big change that we made for children, which made some people crazy, was that the expressed wish to be of the other gender was no longer a necessary criterion. And some people didn't like that because, you're just pathologizing gender nonconformity. Our argument at the time was that in Toronto, we saw some kids where they showed every, let's call it, subjective or phenomenological indicator that they were struggling with their gender, but for socially desirable reasons, they weren't expressing the wish to be the other gender. It wasn't a lot of cases, but there were some, and we published some documentation of that in these white books that all of the different committees contributed to. But people thought, oh, no, that's you're just pathologizing gender nonconformity, which certainly wasn't the intent.
We'll come back to this in...
Yes. Well, in DSM-5, we changed it, but we'll come back to it.
And we'll come back to it in a minute, because you couldn't have predicted that this would be how they would reject all of your desistance literature, because you took out that essential criterion, and therefore now trans activists say, oh, well, all of that literature was in DSM-4 time, so therefore those kids weren't really trans. That's why they all desisted. Am I correct?
That's the criticism that they make. However, I would rebut that in a few ways. First of all, in our reanalyses, we included kids who were diagnosed during the time of DSM-3 plus the time of DSM-4. And again, what I would say is that the number of kids, let's say in our clinic, who would have gotten the complete DSM-4 diagnosis, who didn't overtly express the desire to be the other gender, was very small. would have been a few cases. So now, could I go back and tell you, well, how many? I can't, because I don't have in my database codes for each symptom, but I don't buy that criticism.
No,
But
no,
could
do
you go
I?
forward? Could you go forward to look at the gender dysphoria diagnosis in the DSM, or do you have something to say before
Well,
that? Mia?
let's get to that evolution first, because that's the one I'm most interested in. So Stella and I interviewed Professor Alan Francis, who was chair of DSM-4 task force, and he suggested to us that he didn't want gender identity disorder in the DSM because he felt that it was just like being gay and therefore you don't need a diagnosis, which sounds very activist-like to me. It sounded to me like trans activists had got to him in the 1990s and the messaging was already coming in. But then the shift from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria in DSM-3, published 2013, there to me is where activism takes over. In my mind, it's very much framed by trans activism, by WPATH, by all the activist groups who they wanted to de-psychopathologize trans identities. Do you agree with that?
So we get to the DSM-5. So they cobble together the committees in 2007, but it didn't really get rolling until 2008 because across all of the committees, the lawyer for the APA had to vet everybody. This is by sketchy memory, but apparently the lawyer for the APA had mental health issues and wasn't doing her job. And so it took a long time to get everybody vetted. So we got rolling in 2008. Now, the DSM-5 was published in 2013, 19 years after the DSM-4. So a lot had been going on in the world. And all of the people who wanted the diagnosis out couldn't do anything because there was no post DSM-4 other than, DSM-4TR. That was just text. So there was an avalanche. And so my committee had to wrestle with, the core criticism of should it be in or out of the DSM-5, right? And so I would say people on the committee had different views. And eventually Jack Drescher, who is a very well-known and prominent psychiatrist who is part of the committee, argued that it should be retained in the DSM-5 for access to care. Now, the critics of the diagnosis, basically talk out of both sides of their mouth. And so on the one hand, they want to depathologize gender dysphoria. It's just a normal variant of human diversity. But on the other hand, it's medically necessary and life-saving. So which is it? If it's just, a variant, why should insurance companies pay for anything? Why should there be clinics that pay tens of thousands of dollars to staff? And if it's not a mental health diagnosis, what is it? And I remember at the WPATH meeting in Oslo, Norway, which would have been, I don't know, maybe 2011 or something. Some dude was arguing, it shouldn't be in the DSM. So I said, okay, fine. Where should it be? And he just shrugged his shoulders. Now, where are we at currently? Well, post DSM 5, 2013, we have ICD 11. where, oh, and I should say one thing. We did propose to the DSM-5 group at large that the diagnosis should kind of be a bridge of the mind and the body and deserve some unique status. They didn't like that. This is a mental health manual. And we had other, proposals like, well, it should be an adjustment disorder. But what do you do after 6 months? Then what? Or it could be in the appendix of the DSM-5, other problems that may come to clinical attention. Okay, yeah, we could put it there.
Huh.
Big problem, though. So it could be a V-code diagnosis. Like siblings quarreling or there being, parent-child conflict. It comes to clinical attention. Big problem. Insurance companies don't pay for V-codes. No good.
That was the reason.
Well, that was our argument.
What do you think? Do you think it should have stayed gender identity disordered as a diagnosis?
What do you think, Stella? What do you think I think?
I think you think it should.
You know me
be
very
gender
well.
identity disorder.
You know me well.
Here.
Yes.
Yeah. I do too, actually. I think the same. I think it should be gender identity. You should have stayed that,
At our the SEGM meeting that is happening in Berlin in September, we're going to have a panel on should there be a different diagnosis. But I have no idea what anybody's going to say. But going back to Alan Francis, Mia, I have never heard him say anything about this. Maybe he said something in committee meetings, but the child psychiatrist, overruled him. But I've never seen any documentation that he has said that. That it's basically.
I was just thinking about the diagnosis and stuff, and I was just asking, I wonder, do you think, some children should have puberty blockers?
Well, I'm going to answer that. 10 years ago, this year will be the 10-year anniversary of my execution and the closing of our clinic. It's been a while, so, a lot of people probably don't even know the story, but I did sue very successfully.
Yeah, could you just say quickly so people who don't know, because there will be people who don't know what happened there. You were a clinic director for decades, and they came out to the car park. And
our clinic lasted 40 years, and local activists got the ear of a new crop of administrators, and their main criticism, I would say, among others, was that we were too cautious when it came to prepubertal children. They couldn't really go after us for our work with adolescents because we were actually the first clinic in North America that recommended hormonal suppression for some adolescents, which I would be glad to go into in terms of why we did that. But they couldn't really criticize us for that, although they didn't like our reasoning. Our reasoning was the perspective that these kids, even if they wanted to resolve their gender dysphoria through psychotherapy, there was no good evidence at the time that that would work. So it was like the only option available to help these kids manage distress was to suppress their puberty and so on and so forth. So we were reviewed, and anyways, we got shut down. But, in the perspective of 2025, which I'll come to in a second, we were critiqued for being too cautious.
And you just want to say, for people who don't know, you were reviewed, you were shut down, trans activists targeted you very badly, and you had your day in court and you won a very handsome settlement. So you were very much vindicated.
Yeah, I received around $550,000, plus they paid all of my legal fees, so it came to like $800,000, and they apologized for certain things that they said about me. The hospital did, and the settlement had to agree that they would make public how much money they were paying me. I was not going to have the, non-disclosure agreement bullshit. So I was very happy. I bought a new suitcase back then, and still have some of that money left. Now, the irony 10 years after, the Cass Review in the UK, they closed the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock in London, which had thousands of patients. Why? Not because they were being too cautious, but because they were being too permissive and not thorough. And I would say, I think we were always pretty damn thorough in what we did. And now, of course, we're in the current incredible sea change of what's happening in the U.S., where every other day over the last few months, we're hearing this child and adolescent gender clinic is closing, or this adolescent clinic is no longer able to prescribe blockers or contrasex hormones. So again, not for being cautious, but for being too permissive and too quick. And then, of course, in the red states, you can't do anything. So it's very dialectical, eh?
Yeah, you've seen it all, really. You've seen the pendulum swinging hard in the other direction. I, of course, I mean, well, I don't know how I feel about puberty blockers. I think I understand why puberty blockers why the idea first came about, but I think it's always been misguided right from the start. But I do like your we interviewed Quentin Van Meter, and he said you would go down into the dark basement and try and figure out what was going on with these kids. That was your approach, was it not, to try and find out what had caused this gender distress and how to help the kid through it? Is that why you were shut down?
I think that we were shut down because we were deemed as not being politically correct. Totally.
The activists did not like you trying to help the kids. It was the era of affirmation. You were shut down because the era of affirmation came along and helping the kids was forbidden.
Yeah. And, the people started throwing around the word conversion therapy, which is like, it's probably the second worst thing somebody can be accused of in North America these days. Probably the worst thing is to be called a racist, but to be a practitioner of conversion therapy, that's, bordering on being a Nazi. And, the irony about all of the legislations where legislations that ban conversion therapy with regard to sexual orientation, the activists have very successfully put the gender identity tail on the sexual orientation dog, where they're merged. You can't try to do this or that. But, the great irony, if you read any of the legislation, it says, well, you can't try to change somebody's gender identity, but then there are do not applies clauses where it's okay to explore identity. Now you could ask the legislators, Well, what does exploring identity mean? Nobody knows. It could mean anything. But that's why, as far as I know, nobody has ever been accused since these legislations have been passed of practicing conversion therapy, or nobody's been convicted of practicing conversion therapy for gender dysphoria, because you can just say, I just explore. I'm not trying to change anything, which is actually the case. I don't think anybody, takes a child or adolescent and shakes them and says, you have to stop feeling the way you're feeling. It's ridiculous.
But is it true? Did you have an approach where you tried to get the kid to be more conforming, in that, yes, you can wear the tutu for a short amount of time each day, but not outside the house, and eventually the aim is to put that tutu away and help the boy blend better? Was that your approach?
Well, I think that it would depend on a particular kid. The child psychiatrist Edgardo Menviel, in the first decade of the 2000s, the example you gave was, he would often advise parents, let Johnny wear the tutu at home, but it's probably not a good idea to wear it to kindergarten because the kids are going to laugh at him.
It's fair.
And the way that I've always conceptualized the surface behaviors are just symptoms, so to speak, of the underlying dysphoria. So, what I'm wanting to explore, let's say a little boy who only plays with girls. Well, I'm developing hypotheses. Why does he only like to play with girls? Well, he's a very temperamentally timid kid. So he's scared of the boys. And in fact, I remember one of the kids I saw was growing up with two gay dads. And he said, I want to be a girl because the boys in my class are very rough and they swear. And I don't like swearing and I don't like being rough. Well, the argument with a kid like that is, well, let's find some boys who don't swear and who aren't too rough so you can feel part of that group. And then maybe that has a feedback effect on your subjective identity. Oh, I can be a boy, but I don't have to swear. That I think was maybe the underlying theoretical perspective. So I don't know.
I really want to ask about the diagnosis, the shift to gender dysphoria, because I think it was WPATH influence. I've read all of the WPATH papers when they went on their de-psychopathologization campaign in 2010, and it appeared to me that they were the ones dreaming up this is how we de-psychopathologize. This is how we make trends natural and innate and healthy, is we change the diagnosis from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And therefore, it's only the distress that you feel because you are trans that requires treatment. Trans itself is not a pathology. It's not a disorder. It's not a mental disorder. Was it WPATH? Were you on the committee? Did you come up with that? Or did you take what WPATH did, the papers that they wrote, that they submitted to the committee, and then you just adopted WPATH's recommendations?
You're asking me to remember things that happened like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I actually have this huge box of DSM-5 documents that's been sitting in my daughter's room for the last 12 years, which I've done nothing with. Maybe the answer is in there. But I'll tell you.
I'd love to see them.
Don't dump them.
I'd love to see them.
You can read about hypersexuality. Because remember there were sexual dysfunctions, paraphilias. But anyways, so off the top of my head, Mia, I would say that WPATH had a very minimal influence on anything that we did. I would say that maybe the biggest influence that they had was changing the diagnostic label from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Now, as the chair of the committee, did I care about the diagnostic label? Absolutely not. It's just a diagnostic label. There are other diagnoses in the DSM-5 that don't have the word disorder in it. Anorexia nervosa, enuresis, encopresis, so on and so forth. So if it made people happy that the word disorder was taken out of the diagnostic label, I could care less. One of the first publications I had back in 1985, I wish I could find it on my shelf, but I can't, was an edited volume called Gender Dysphoria. Gender dysphoria was a term coined by the surgeon Fisk back in the early 70s. And for me, as a psychologist, gender dysphoria is a completely reasonable diagnostic label. It's phenomenological. It's getting at subjectivity. Who cares if the label is gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder? And then anybody who says, oh, it was removed from the DSM-5, they're just idiots. It wasn't removed.
But you thought that at the time. Do you still think that now? Because my way, when I'm looking at it, I see that evolution as being, that is when they made it that trans is natural and healthy. And that is really dangerous and has a much wider implication in that
well, if
everybody
it's so natural
now,
and healthy, why should insurance companies pay for anything? Now, I will say one thing. Initially, in our proposal to alter the diagnostic label, we had proposed gender incongruence. So it's kind of going back to Green and Money, 1960, 1961. WPATH did not like that proposal because they said it was too vague, that it was sort of pathologizing mere gender nonconformity. And plus, some of the people in Europe said, doesn't translate, the word gender incongruence doesn't translate very well into German, or if you look at the Dutch, like it's such a long, so people didn't like gender incongruence. So gender dysphoria was actually our second choice, I think.
But the fact of the matter is that when it moved from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, conceptually, it was a revolution. It really transformed. I agree with you, there's anorexia nervosa, and people are completely hung up on the naming of an awful lot of terms, and they're all wrong. However, for this particular one, it feels like you were had. To me, it feels like you were swindled into something there.
I've never seen it that way.
To me, changing from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, WPATH were very clear in all of the papers that they wrote, and this is 2010, 2011, when they're all getting together in their work groups. They were very clear that the reason they wanted this shift is because that would mean that trans identities were natural and healthy, and the disorder is the distress that you feel because you have this this mismatch of your mind and body. But to me, that opened the door to the era of affirmation because it made trans natural and healthy. And if it's natural and healthy, why would anyone try and find out the cause? Why would anyone try and help reconcile body and mind? You don't need to, because it's natural and healthy. And so it led to the only way you can help these people is by giving them hormones and surgeries to resolve the gender dysphoria, the distress.
So WPATH types, for example, when the ICD-11 was in its developmental phase, they very virulently did not want a diagnosis for children. It should be limited to just adolescence and adulthood. So gender incongruence should just be for adolescents and adults. So Sam Winter, who was part of the ICD triad of Peggy Cohen-Ketnes and Jack Drescher, wanted the diagnosis to apply only for adolescents and adults because there's nothing to do for children. There's no treatment. You have to wait until they hit puberty. And I would say that probably there were people in WPATH who probably felt the same way about there not being a child diagnosis, but I can't remember if anybody actually officially said that. I think the way that I've seen it over the years, and maybe I'm wrong, is that people basically are hypocrites. On the one hand, it's just a normal variation. On the other hand, it's medically necessary to treat gender dysphoria. It's life-saving. You can't have it both ways. And so what we now know is that I'll just say one more thing. There are some clinicians in the U.S., when they bill, they do not bill to get reimbursed for gender dysphoria. What they bill for is an ICD diagnosis called endocrine disorder unspecified. So you could be seeing a 4-year-old and you bill for endocrine disorder unspecified. Now you look in the ICD, what's an example of an unspecified endocrine disorder? There isn't one. There are no examples.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't want to keep pushing the point, we'll move on, but to me, gender dysphoria was the clever plan of how to have it both ways. You can have it both ways with gender dysphoria. You have the natural, healthy mismatch that everyone should celebrate, but with that mismatch comes the distress, and therefore, because as well, their goal was access to hormones and surgeries. That's WPATH's goal. That's why they exist, to get trans-identified people access to hormones and surgeries. And gender dysphoria, the only way to treat it is with hormones and surgeries. You can't do anything about the mind, so you have to treat the body. But anyway, I think we should.
Can I just add a point as well, and then you go ahead, Mia? I just think, you've got to look at it in the larger, like the bigger picture, really. And, when you realize how much of a long game a lot of activists have played, and they've been very purposeful. And, the change, let's say, the change from the HBIGDA, that awful name, to a very clever and sassy WPATH in around 2006, 2007, 2008. That was, for me, a really pivotal point around trans activism and organizing themselves and lobbying and financial funding. They really got themselves together conceptually around them. And so then 5 years later, gender identity disorder gets discarded in gender dysphoria. It does look, with the hindsight that I have of, looking back, it looks of a piece.
Well, it is. You can see it, though. Whittle takes over in 2007. They rebrand. They start these work groups to pressure the APA to get the diagnosis changed because they want to de-psychopathologize. It's not even speculation. The evidence, it's all right there. You can read it all. That's what they did. But I want to go back to... Oh, okay.
I'll just say one more thing. One model that I think... let's say the gender affirmative approach really was imitating, so to speak, was gay affirmative therapy, right? So that became very popular in the 1990s. And I know that there are people in WPATH, pretty important people, who were, very strong proponents of gay affirmative therapy. So just like you have, classical minority stress theory applied to sexual orientation, that's now been extended to gender minority stress. So everything is external. It's all stress, external stress.
I've never heard of gay affirmative therapy. That's interesting. That's an interesting parallel, isn't it?
It's you're too young, Mia. That's the problem.
Okay.
When was gay affirmative? Because that's really, I think, very important. When was that, gay affirmative therapy?
In the 90s, did you say?
Is that part of, I've often wondered, that phrase affirmative action? Is that where they because it was all about affirmative action for gay people. Was that part of it?
Maybe. I'll see if I can dig up some books on my shelf that are titled Gay Affirmative Therapy.
That's interesting.
Okay. Yeah,
and I'll
email
you guys. Yeah.
Questions?
Okay. I want to go back to Christina Olson, that study that on social transition. So she followed up for 5 years kids who had been socially transitioned. 97, I think, 0.5% were still identifying as transgender after 5 years, and so they somehow conclude that these were all true trans kids, and medicalizing them is okay. Maybe I'm adding that conclusion, but that's certainly the activist interpretation of her study. So what can you tell us about desistance, persistence, and the power of social transition?
Christina Olson, who's a psychologist, she's now at Princeton. For many years now, she's been following a very large sample of kids who socially transitioned, and she has a comparison group, siblings, and also cisgender kids.
Ooh.
And
interesting.
She just published a huge monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. I'll email you the PDF, but it's like, almost 200 pages, and it contains their most recent follow-up data. It's based on one of her students' PhDs, so it's a hugely important work. I've just started to read it, but this is what she reports. This is my summary. So the kids are now all on average between 15 and a half and 16. So what she reports on is the stability of the kid's identity compared to the baseline from childhood, based on the self-report of the youth and the self-report of the parents. So by parent report, 88.5% of the trans kids still identify that way.
Wow.
By youth report, it's 81.6%. Now, what are they actually identifying as if they're not identifying as trans? I don't know. I have to look. But she also has nice data on the controls, right? So by parent report, 91.6% of the cis kids in childhood still identify as cis 10 years later, let's say. Of the siblings, 86.5% still are cis, but interestingly, 15% are not. But let's just concentrate on the majority. It's showing that a large percentage of these three groups of kids have a stable identity. So in the case of the trans kids, and I began to write about this in 2018, where I predicted a social transition is going to greatly increase the odds of continuing to identify that way. Not making a value judgment on it, but just this is the this is the pathway they're going to go down is totally confirmed by her latest set of data. And so if, let's say by parent report, you've got 88% still identifying as trans. In our follow-up study of kids in Toronto, only 12% were persisters of both our boys and girls. And even if we just included the DSM-3 kids, not the sub-threshold cases, 70% of our full DSM-3 cases had desisted. So her kids their developmental trajectory is very different. Now, the other element is she also reports in this paper, I think for the first time, sexual orientation data.
Oh.
And a substantial majority of the cis kids and the siblings, mid-adolescents, identify as straight in relation to their birth sex. And in the trans kids, for both the ones born male and female, they don't even use the term sex in their monograph. So when you're reading and they're referring to the trans kids as boys, you have to realize these are the biological females. They refer to the trans kids as girls, you have to remember these are biological males. But both the biological male and female trans kids, the most predominant sexual orientation that they self-report is that they're same-sex attracted.
They identify as heterosexual then, but they're actually same-sex attracted?
Correct. Exactly.
Oh, that's...
So
okay.
What I've written about social transition is, one could say a grandmother would say, "Are you surprised that this has happened? Did you really need to do a study?" But I think it does have educational implications so that parents who, for whatever reason, are involved in a social transition of their kid just need to know this is where things are going. It's not placing a value judgment in them.
Can I take you up on that? This idea of not making a value judgment on it, is it not our jobs as clinicians to make a value judgment on something that would require treatment that will harm their bodies? Is that not exactly the responsibility we should be taking?
You have to express your value judgments with clinical etiquette.
Yeah, desistance should be an openly, unapologetically goal of treatment, because that's what it is for every other condition.
Yeah.
We seek to, if somebody comes in with anorexia, we seek desistance. That's what we seek. That's what clinicians...
I think, what I'm trying to get at is, like, if one thinks psychodynamically, for example, and you realize that each story is complicated, is deeply complicated, and the decision to transition a kid or to participate in it, there are different reasons and motivations. So one has to be very careful in working with families. I think some people fall into it in what I would say an innocent way. They don't really realize where this is going. Then there are other families that I have worked with where they feel pressured by external people, like a pediatrician or maybe a clinician, that this is what you have to do to support your child. So a couple of years ago, I happened to be consulting with a mother of an 8-year-old who went to some parent group, and the leader of the parent group had a trans kid herself. and said to the mother, if you don't trans your kid tomorrow, they will kill themselves when they're older. So the mother was scared to death and trans the kid. Then
I just
I
feel
think
I
I'll
feel
just
quite
say
strong that
one or two other
you
quick
go and
things,
then I'll.
Stella. I think there are other stories where people do it coming from like a complicated intellectual point of view that they don't feel like they should impose their own values on their kid, so they're following the lead of the kid. And then lastly, I think there are some families where there are complicated psychodynamics that fuel this. So my perspective is that in all of the cases, it's more than just essentialism, but it's varies from one family to the next.
But
So
you seem to be looking at it from the perspective of the parent's decision to consent, whereas I think Stella, or I'll say, I'm looking at it from the perspective, I'm not blaming any of the parents. I'm looking at it as this is a total failure. If you flip from an 80% desistance rate to an 88% persistence rate with this intervention, and with persistence comes a medical pathway, lifelong medical intervention for many of them, that's a failed intervention. That's the way I look at it. I'm not blaming the parent, not blaming the parent at all. I'm looking at it purely from the perspective of this as an intervention. The fact that it has flipped from desistance of 80% to persistence of 88% means that this is a failed intervention.
Or even desistance of 80% to desistance of 12%.
Yes.
That's actually what these treatments are.
Yeah, and it's not even a failed intervention. It's a dangerous intervention. It's harmful.
Well, the first part of what you said is important, and I want to just put this on the table. When I have a good working relationship with parents, one of the things that I will tell them is, we're not in court, so nobody's blaming anybody. The goal is to understand why things have happened, right? So just wanted to put that on the table. Now the second part is, now say the second part again, that it's, you're saying it's a failed, I know. Well, one of the things that I have written about a little bit, although it's, a bit provocative to say it, is, so in one little paper I wrote, I said, one thing people have to wrap their heads around is that social transition is not some kind of event that's happening in vacuo. This is a psychosocial treatment that is going to increase the odds of a kid going down a certain pathway. And if I adopted what, you're arguing, is that I could argue that this is iatrogenic, that this is going to make things worse, not better. But that's a very provocative way to argue, provocative thing to argue.
I don't think it's provocative. I think it's actually a responsible and incredibly important thing for somebody to say, especially a clinician who's been working for decades in the field as yourself. You have the kind of experience, you have the academic know-how, you've got it all. And I would argue it's very much your job to say, yeah, this treatment is evidently better treatment for this condition than that treatment. And that's your clinical judgment.
But based on the Olson results, like if you look at that paper by Christina Olson, surely in your clinical judgment, you can see that social transition is not desirable. It's harmful. Can you not?
Well, we could say it's increasing the odds of the necessity of biomedical treatment for these kids to stay gender dysphoria free. And actually, that gets into another really interesting issue, which, and also going back to what Stella just said, is that, I love the gender resistance groups that are now around, including Stella being a pioneer of a gender rebellious person. I've told Stella she would have been great in the Irish Republican Army back in the day because she's got a lot of
Maybe I
courage.
was, Kim. Maybe I was.
That was only a phase. But that what these different groups are not talking enough about is this subgroup of kids who have socially transitioned before puberty. Think about what's happening in the States now. What's going to happen to these kids who hit puberty and now all of a sudden nobody's willing to put the kids on hormones? So these are going to be severely gender dysphoric kids whose bodies are either masculinizing and they don't want their body to masculinize, or their body's going to feminize and they don't want it to feminize. So these kids are going to have a tough time, I think.
I feel the affirmative concept has slipped in for an awful lot of clinicians that have been working in the field for so long. It's like it got into their skin almost. It got into their way of thinking. And I think it's very important when you're a clinician and you're taking your job seriously that you realize desistance is our bread and butter. Desistance is our goal. That's what our goal for. I don't just work in gender. Desistance is the thing. That's what we're looking for. And I think an absolute unapologetic and very strong and firm. Actually, there's something about the affirmative kind of therapeutic processes moved into therapeutic support that it's like all these clinicians who are really, I would say, very well informed like yourself, are sliding into affirmation.
Well, a close colleague of mine who was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst named Richard Friedman, who wrote about sex differences in behavior back in the early 70s. He wrote a lot about homosexuality. He was a pretty deep thinker. And one of the things he used to tell me, he passed away a few years ago, is when it comes to sex and gender nowadays, people stop thinking. Yeah. And I think that's the dilemma the field is in. Like, so, a 15-year-old walks into a community mental health clinic or just a general medical clinic, they can walk out with a prescription for hormones after a half hour. So that's kind of like the informed consent model, right? Or treatment on demand. There's nothing to think about.
Yeah. Maybe we should change gears. There's another question that we wanted to ask about, which was a kind of an aside that happened as a result of our interview with Alan Francis from the DSM. And then there was a little bit of chat on Twitter, and it took both mine and Mia's attention. Do you want to ask the question, Mia? Because you'll probably have the details better than me.
I couldn't. I tried to find the details and I couldn't. So I hope you remember better than I do. It was Alan Francis tried to sabotage DSM-5, the work that, I don't know if it was you and Ray Blanchard or just Ray Blanchard's work or something. Do you remember what it was? Can you give us the details?
Oh, sure.
Very interesting and important point. Yeah,
I remember
I'm
what
glad
it was.
you're told me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was the chair of the sexual and gender identity disorders work group, and there were 3 sub-work groups: GID, sexual dysfunctions, paraphilias. Ray was the chair of the paraphilia sub-work group. Ray had done years and years of research on pedophilia. And what we proposed for the DSM-5 was that there be subtypes. So you would have males who were pedophilic, meaning they were sexually attracted to prepubertal children. The second subtype was hebephilic, meaning attraction to girls or boys who are just in the early stages of puberty. And we know that, nowadays puberty starts at age 10, 11, and so on and so forth. And then a third subtype, pedohebephilic. So a sexual orientation or attraction to both prepubertal and hebephilic children. Now, the key underlying assumption one has to make is that we're talking about a person's erotic preference. So, in other words, a male who is primarily sexually aroused by a prepubertal child, or a male who is predominantly aroused by an early pubertal child, over physically mature adults who we call teleophiles, or, late adolescent people who would have a different term. So we're talking about an erotic preference for either prepubertal or early pubertal children. Well, when this proposal came out, Alan Francis said incredibly stupid things about the proposal, that it's normal to be sexually attracted to young adolescent girls. He's heterosexual, so that's who he's thinking about. But he completely did not seem to understand we're talking about a preference, not, this 14-year-old is cute, blah, blah, blah. And not only that, and I think the reason they were objecting to this is because the field has had to come to recognize that because puberty is happening earlier and earlier, you have to take that into account. You're not talking about an attraction to somebody who is in late puberty and so on and so forth. And so he was basically completely misunderstanding the concept of an erotic preference and basically saying, oh, it's normal to be attracted to 12-year-olds. And
so he didn't allow it?
Well, he had no direct influence. But our proposal was sabotaged by somebody else at 1 minute to midnight by another psychiatrist.
Okay.
I think it was independent of Alan Francis. But after 7 years of work, hundreds upon hundreds of hours, a very senior psychiatrist in the American Psychiatric Association who had a bee in his bonnet because he was worried that having the subtypes in there would be harmful from a legal point of view for sex offenders. And even though it had passed all of the committees, everybody had given their stamp of approval, this very powerful guy, literally, Mia and Sel, at 1 minute to midnight, killed the whole thing.
Wow.
7
years of work.
And I've always said, it's to get a diagnosis, let's say, in the DSM, you have to have some data to get in the tent. But it's more than just data. There's an awful lot of politicking. And this guy was a very, very, very powerful dude who was brought on board at the very last minute. Like if this guy had been brought on board and shared with
Oh,
us
ma.
his forensic concerns like in 2008, maybe we would have said, maybe we would have been able to
It's
persuade the
discussed.
guy, or
Yeah.
maybe we would have said, okay, we don't want to be involved. You're not interested in the science, so we're done. So Alan Francis was just like a mosquito.
Okay.
He's out of the game, and he doesn't like being out of the game. That's all.
Okay. I just want to reiterate, that point about the hebephile. Is that what it's called? The
Hebephilia, yeah.
hebephile, the man who, yeah, hebephilia. That when I was a child, that was very commonly accepted in society. You remember the way they kind of did a countdown to various kids' 16th birthday, and there was so many, in the tabloid, these gym slip mums, and there was all these pictures of girls in their school uniforms. It was just so culturally accepted
Wow.
in society.
But what I would
And now
say
it isn't.
is that I think that 16-year-olds, if you have let's say a quote preference for 16-year-olds, I don't think they would be considered in most cases hebephilic because puberty is too
No,
advanced.
aren't saying it's the countdown to the 16 because she's legal then. So
Oh,
they
I
were
see.
quite blatantly, yeah. And you remember Bill Wyman, he started going out with Mandy Smith, and I think she was 13.
Yeah.
And like, like that was just in plain sight. It was extraordinary. But I just remember it was culturally accepted. I remember very well that it was culturally accepted, and now it isn't. I just wanted to highlight that to remind people of it. But have we any last question before we finish, Mia? Is there one last, I think?
Well, I mean, can we talk about amputees for a moment, and then we
Oh,
then we
yeah.
end it?
Yes, please do. The body identity.
Right. I
integrity.
think this was before we hit record that we were talking about this. I don't think this happened earlier in the conversation, but you mentioned to me that Michael first really wanted body integrity identity disorder, or the other way around,
Yeah.
BIID, into the DSM-5. And I'll confess, I actually thought it was in the DSM, and you told me it didn't make it in there. Is that correct? And do you think it should be in there?
It didn't make it into the DSM-5. I don't even think it made it into the criteria sets for further study. But off the top of my head, I can't tell you why. I would really have to go back through my notes.
Could you describe what it is for the viewers?
So BIID refers to predominantly males, but I think also females, who feel that they should have at least one of their limbs, whether it's an arm or a leg, amputated because they feel that having that limb removed will make them feel more whole. So they're very distressed by having four limbs. Now, there's also another group of people who are erotically attracted to people who are missing a limb, but that's another category. And
Wait, are you saying the motivation for BIID is erotic? It's a paraphilia?
For some people, we think it is. I think Michael first wanted to minimize the erotic component, but I think from my understanding, certainly for a lot of people, it's a very important component.
Would
we were
you
also
say it's fair to say for most?
How about the majority off the top of my head?
Okay.
The other month when we were emailing about this, I made reference to a case report I came across, actually from Montreal, of a young adult male who asked to have, I think, 2 digits of one of his hand removed.
Yep.
And they did a lot of exploration, maybe medication, this, that, and the other, and the distress persisted, and they made a decision to amputate 2 of the digits. And then there was a follow-up paper where they said apparently this young man is doing well. So unusual encounters, right? Our field is never boring.
Just quickly, do you see the parallel to trends that I see?
Sure. Yeah. And
Because,
I mean,
you
one of
follow up.
the, how did people wind up? Well, I mean, one argument, how did people wind up going down the hormone surgery pathway? Remember, a paper that was published in 1961 in the widely read journal Acta Psychiatrica Scandinavica, where a psychiatrist wrote that he used the term transvestism when he really meant transsexualism. And he said transvestism defies psychiatric intervention. So it was like, we don't know what to do. This is the only option we have left. And I think that was the model. Now, one could argue that during that period of time applied to a lot of adults, that various options were explored and exhausted. But can we be so confident in 2025? And the answer clearly has to be no, with, for example, the emergence of ROGD teenagers who have totally, well, in my view, have totally forced us to rethink clinical management of adolescent gender dysphoria. So, if you read the original Dutch protocol of eligibility for blockers, one of the criteria the Dutch uses, you had to have a lifelong, persistent history of gender variance. Well, if I'm seeing a 13-year-old who's just come out as trans 3 months ago, that's not lifelong. And so we need to be really careful.
And we need to make a lot of clinical judgments.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Yes,
As
thank you.
always,
That was
very
so
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah.
Good talking to the two of you.